This is Center for Israel Education's 7th webinar on the Hamas-Israel war, Israel's border regions, Islam and Turkey. And we're going to have to add to that, of course, knowledge of a hostage release deal. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center and emeritus professor of Middle Eastern history and political science at Emory University. Our center's mission remains to educate and inform broadly the general public on all aspects of modern Israel, including international relations, Israeli society and identity, Zionist Israeli history, culture, and more. Core to our work is the use of timely analyses, such as this webinar, based on irrefutable sources from English, Hebrew, and Arabic. We post our materials on our center's website, israeled.org. Join us on israeled.org for learning about Israel. Included in the websites have been special sections on the Hamas-Israel war, suggested readings on Jewish peoplehood, Zionism, and Israel. We're an independent entity, and we like to engage teens, young adults, educators, and the general public. For example, on Sunday, November 12th, we had 41 Atlanta teens who learned with us for 4 hours. If you believe teens in your location are interested and have the funds to support the undertaking, go to our website and get in touch with Debbie Sassone, who runs our teen program. The Hamas-Israel war unfolded unexpectedly with horrific results after October 7th. On that Sabbath morning, several thousand Hamas terrorists poured across Israel's border with the Gaza Strip, raped, beheaded, burned, and murdered Israelis and others, and took some 239 hostages. Some of those hostages, we learned last evening, will be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. Joining us for the 7th webinar are 3 very highly talented analysts and scholars: Professor Shai Feldman from Brandeis University, Professor Yitzhak Reiter, Ashkelon College, and Alan Makovsky, the Center for American Progress. With Shai starting it off, what have you seen now over the last 45 or 47 days? The goals, the objectives, accomplishments, frustrations?
The war objectives have not changed. The Israeli government continues to adhere to the goals as it stipulated in the beginning of the ground operation, which was essentially to, let's call it, relieve Hamas of any fighting capability and also any governing capability in Gaza. As far as where things are at the moment, number one, this is not 1948 or 56 or 67. This is a hard war. The most important piece of information that was actually kind of hidden in a most recent report of one of the most respected defense journalists in Israel noted that he wrote, half of the battalions of Hamas in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, where the thrust of the IDF operation focuses on, half of the Hamas battalions have been seriously damaged. To emphasize this, only half of Hamas's battalions in the northern part of Gaza, which has been the focus of the IDF until now, have been seriously damaged, which means that even in the north, half of the Hamas battalions have not been damaged seriously, which means that the IDF is meeting considerable resistance. This is not a cakewalk. That's number one. Number two, operations in the southern part of the Gaza Strip have only begun, and they are going to be even more complicated than in the northern part of the Gaza Strip because the population is now condensed in the southern part. It's not just that the operations will be difficult, but the pressures on Israel regarding humanitarian assistance and so on and so forth, it's going to be extensive given the fact that this human shield around Hamas is even thicker, much thicker, in the south part of Gaza. And we don't know exactly what the nature of the military operations in the south will be. Beyond that, the debate in Israel about the day after, what happens if Israel does achieve its objectives of depriving the Gaza Strip of Hamas's fighting capability and governing capability, who is going exactly to replace? Is it going to be somebody? Is it going to be chaos and anarchy? What exactly is going to happen? This is probably a subject regarding which there's going to be the fiercest debate in the Security Cabinet when the day comes.
I would like to start with the government goals of the war in Gaza. The government announced two goals. One of them was to destroy all of the capabilities, the military capabilities, the infrastructure, and the political arm of Hamas. And the second one was to release those who are hostages among Hamas in Gaza. The problem is that the Israeli society is divided. The question is, what of the two goals is primary? Is it the war to destroy Hamas, or is it to, first of all, release the hostages? The government discourse is that the two goals are parallel. And I think that it is impossible. It is something that cannot go together. You have to decide what you prefer. Do you first release the hostages or continue fighting the Hamas military capabilities? I'm afraid that Israel will not achieve the goal of destroying Hamas because of many reasons. First of all, there is the first round of releasing hostages, about 50 hostages. Israel committed itself to 4 days of cessation of fire, which will give the Hamas another opportunity to reconfigure their deployment in their outposts and strongholds in the Gaza Strip. A second issue that Shai mentioned also is that perhaps Israel succeeded to get rid of 50% of the Hamas fighters in the northern part of Gaza Strip, but still in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, Israel will have much more difficulties fighting within a very condensed society of about 1.5 million or more. Perhaps 2 million, almost of all of the Gaza Palestinians are now at the southern part of the Strip. And I doubt if Israel could put an end to Hamas as a political wing. Hamas is popular among the Palestinian society. It was popular before the 7th of October. According to public opinion polls, the Hamas leader was defeating Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the PLO and the PA. Hamas also was popular among the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, not only in the Gaza Strip. Well, there is some criticism within the Strip, and I believe that after the war, this voice will be more salient among the Gazan Palestinians. But I think that we are now at the point that we do not know how this war will end.
Unlike Shai and Yitzhak, I'm not an Israeli, I'm not in Israel, and I'm not a military guy. I'm in Washington. But let me just give you a couple of thoughts to underscore the point that Shai made about the incompleteness of the Israeli military operation so far. The fact that rockets are still flying into Israel every day, sirens are still going off. It seems to me that it's telling. Also, the fact that there are still, I've seen various estimates, but approximately 200,000 Israelis displaced, which has never happened before in Israeli history, shows that this war is far from over. I think that is not reflected so much in the media here in the US. I think the key thing to watch right now, from a Washington perspective, is the pressure on President Biden. Biden has been stalwart in supporting Israel's right to go after Hamas. There is a lot of pressure in the party to call for a ceasefire, for a permanent ceasefire. Much of your audience may have seen a recent survey that showed Democrats by approximately 2-1, I believe it was 53-27, favor a ceasefire. I do wonder, once these hostage exchanges begin, and they reportedly have a rolling aspect to them, that if they go smoothly, that more hostages can be released for a longer pause. I think the pressure to turn that long pause into a permanent ceasefire is going to increase dramatically. Now, it has not shown itself quite as dramatically in Congress as it has in general public opinion, particularly on the Democratic side. I think 24 House members wrote a letter to Biden recently asking for a ceasefire. And as far as I know, only 2 senators, including the number 2 Democrat in the Senate, Dick Durbin, have called for a ceasefire, but it's going to be more difficult for Israel to resume its operations. And I'll just make one more comment in terms of public opinion in the US. As it's absorbed from and formed by the media, I think that it has not come across that this is an existential war for Israel. Israeli leaders talked, and I believe Netanyahu himself talked about at the beginning, this is another 1948, it's a second war of independence. That has really not come across convincingly, and I think Israel needs to do a better job to explain that, because if you don't see it as existential, it's all the more reason why one might advocate a ceasefire.
The hostage deal, it includes a ceasefire. It's a 4-day process, maybe longer, in which Hamas and Israel have agreed to exchange prisoners. It seems to me one of the crux benefits of this hostage deal is that Hamas gets to buy time, refurbish itself. That conforms, I think, to a pattern it's had in the 4 previous engagements with Israel. It gets engaged militarily. The international community comes down on Israel for not being proportionate. Then a ceasefire evolves, and then Hamas refurbishes itself. Aside from that process, what does this hostage deal, in your view, do for families in Israel where loved ones may be released, and for families in Israel where loved ones may not be released? And what does it do to overarching society at large?
So the short answer to your question is that this is going to be a heart-wrenching period for Israel, because it would include the 2 dimensions that you mentioned. There will be joy seeing children return and women return, but there would still be close to 200 hostages that will remain in the Gaza Strip. It may come down to 180, but we remember how the population essentially created pressure on the Israeli government to make a deal, the Gilad Shalit deal. At least I would not have supported. This is a completely different dimension than Gilad Shalit. This was one soldier, not a civilian, one soldier that was in the hands of Hamas. Now we're talking about 239 Israelis, most of them civilians.
And Shalit was exchanged for more than 1,000 prisoners, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, more than 1,000. So the next few days are going to be heartbreaking. That's one thing. But I have to make it very, very clear. I don't think that the Israeli government had any alternative than to accept the deal as was presented. It may be improved slightly on the margins, the deal in the last week or so. But generally speaking, this is a deal that Yahya Sinwar offered. And the Israeli government, I don't think, had any choice but to accept the deal. Because we have to remember, this deal reflects the catastrophe of October 7th. And the people who had either a direct or indirect responsibility for essentially abandoning the population in the Gaza envelope could not but accept a deal that promises to at least return some of those who were abducted. However, nobody should underestimate the risks and the costs for Israel of this deal. First of all, in military operations, any pause in the tempo is a big problem. The IDF is today a large, cumbersome military machine, and it can't be easily switched on and switched off and switched on and switched off. This is going to affect the tempo of military operations without a doubt. That's number one. Number two, it's pausing in a situation in which Israel is in the thick of the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which means that it's a vulnerable military machine. It has large tanks and armored personnel carriers and so on and so forth. And it's not fighting against a similar army. It's fighting against an insurgency that lives in the tunnels and lives in whatever places to hide they have in the northern part of Gaza. And they therefore know the turf better than the Israelis. It's their home turf. When the fighting will resume, they will have an initial advantage. They will have prepared themselves. They have, first of all, rested. They have prepared themselves and so on. The political leaders, in the way they present this to the general public, they are not presenting it in Churchillian terms. In Churchillian terms, you present to the public the realities, and the realities are very inconvenient at the moment. And you explain to the public that, yes, it's a risk for soldiers that are in the units that are in the thick of the Gaza Strip, and that Israel has a moral commitment to the abducted, and it has no choice but to accept this deal. But the effort to kind of downplay the risk and say the head of the Shabak and the chief of staff of the IDF said we can control the risks and so on and so forth. First of all, I don't think the public in Israel today, after the catastrophe of October 7th, easily buys some note that the prime minister seems to say that he's gotten from this head of this security service of another security service. My mentor in the beginning of my career was General Amal Yariv. General Yariv was the person who, during the October War, was the first one who faced the nation and told the nation how bad the situation is, so that nobody would think or even interpret or understand otherwise. And I think we are lacking somebody who would face the nation courageously and explain that this is not easy and this is not risk-free.
If the ceasefire is prolonged, then Israel could find itself in northern Gaza and maybe mired there without any kind of ability to withdraw, particularly if there's another promise at the end of this for another 5 days of ceasefire and then another 50 hostages released. In other words, this agreement could change as the agreement is implemented, which would have implications for Israel's fighting forces on the ground. Now, we don't know that for certain, but that's not an option to be discounted. Yitzhak, how do you sense civil society reacting to 50 people coming back and the others still regretful that their loved ones are not returned?
First of all, I agree with what Shai said before, and I have only one point to add, which is that we have to remember that the hostages are at the hand of the head of a snake in Gaza that Israel intends to kill. So Israel is now negotiating with the leader of Hamas that is using the hostages in order to keep them as his insurance policy, so to speak, for his life and the life of perhaps the rest of the higher leadership of Hamas, which also causes a problem for Israel in the way to achieve or to accomplish its goals. The Israeli society is politically divided, particularly after the 7th of October. The sentiment is of anger, where I am volunteering daily on the Crisis Civil Center of Dizengoff Center in Tel Aviv. From what I hear from the people there, people who flee from the north and from the south, they are also divided. Some of them say we should not agree to this deal. We should insist on releasing all of the hostages. And if Hamas is unwilling to this agreement, to a package of all of the hostages in return for all of the Palestinian prisoners, we will have to fight and to exert pressure on the military wings of Hamas until they will surrender. Something that is hard to believe that it will happen. The Israeli society will also be heartbroken with a situation that only part of their hostages are coming home. The children, infants, women or mothers and the elder people. And what about most of the others who are soldiers? As Shai said before, Israel is committed morally, and the IDF is committed morally to bring home all of its prisoners of war or hostages or whatever. So I think that we are going to face a very uneasy period, which will impact on the battlefield. As you said, Ken, the international pressure on Israel due to the results on the ground, casualties, and so on. I have to admit that I do not know what will be the outcome of the current situation.
there are variables that sit on Israel's border that could influence the breaking of the ceasefire or the stoppage of the hostage exchange. We have philosophical movements like Islam. We have countries like Turkey. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the concept of Islam having an influence over the resilience of Hamas, and ask Alan to talk a little bit about how Turkey sees this sitting where it does, but being a very keen supporter of Hamas's actions.
I think that Hamas succeeded to employ religious symbols, and particularly the issue of the Al Aqsa Mosque, which is Har HaBayit or the Temple Mount, in recent years. Hamas ideology, the extreme ideology that Israel should be wiped out of the map and a Palestinian part of the Islamic Caliphate should be established on the Palestine soil and so on, perhaps is accepted by many Palestinians, even those who do not belong to Hamas. But the Palestinians in the West Bank, as an example, or even in the Gaza Strip, they are unhappy with the Islamic form that Hamas is imposing on its people. But they successfully used the Al-Aqsa issue, meaning the Israeli policies at the Temple Mount of increase of visitation. The visitation to the Temple Mount increased 10 times in the last decade, from 5,000 to 50,000 today. The police allows to violate the status quo, things that were not possible like 5, 6, 7 years ago. Those who are visiting the Temple Mount organizations, they are praying silently, but praying, violating the status quo. And every Muslim, not only in Palestine, every Muslim that you will ask will tell you that he believes that Israel is going to take over the Temple Mount, if not to divide it by time and space. And Hamas was exploiting this issue. We could see it in the last 2 years that Hamas is building a political flagship in order to capture the hearts and minds of all of the Muslims around the world, in order that once they will attack Israel, they will get the support of the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Indonesians, and others, Yemenites, if you like. So 2 years ago, they even warned Israel that if Israel will launch the March of the Flags on the Jerusalem Day on May 2021, after riots broke out in Israel, they will launch rockets into Israel. And indeed, it is the first time that they fired rockets towards Jerusalem. And they also used the issue of Al Aqsa to expose the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is incapable to defend Al Aqsa, and they are the defenders of Al Aqsa. They used it 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and then last year. And even now, the attack or the assault of the 7th of October was named Tufan Al Aqsa, meaning the Al Aqsa flood. The flood is mentioned in the Quran twice, once in the context of Noah and once in the context of the children of Israel, exodus of Egypt. In both, it is a God punishment to all of the non-believers. And this is their image of this assault. They also use another image, which is also mentioned in Quran as well as in the Islamic traditions, of a military attack on the Kaaba in Mecca of the year 570 AD. The Ababil birds that were used by God to throw clay stones on the army of Abraha, who was riding an elephant, was a military surprise to the Meccans in order to conquer the Kaaba. These are the images of Hamas. They present themselves as the defenders of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And Muslims around the world believe that Al-Aqsa is in danger. It is the campaign that began in 1996 by the Islamic movement, which is also identified with the Hamas. And that is why in 2015 it was outlawed by Israel. And that explains why, in spite of the fact that we have Arab countries who signed peace agreement with Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Abraham Accords, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and so on, it becomes a peace between governments and not peace between the people. Most of the Muslims, they believe that Israelis are endangering the third holiest place in Islam. I warned in op-eds that I published in Israel that Israel should be handling very carefully the issue of the Temple Mount, not to give ammunition to its enemies to be used and exploited as Hamas is doing today.
Just to pick up on Yitzhak's point, on October 7th, when Erdogan first responded to the horror that took place, Erdogan is the president of Turkey. He's been the effective leader of Turkey since his party won parliamentary elections in 2002. And in 2014, he became Turkey's first directly elected president. He's been reelected twice since then. He represents a dramatic change in what Turkey had always been. Turkey had been a strongly secular regime founded in 1923, 100 years ago, by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. And the military over the decades tended to be the iron wall, making sure that secularism remained the law of the land. Erdogan has tried to bring Islam into the equation gradually. In particular, he's brought it very visibly into Turkish culture. Turkey has not adopted Sharia law. I don't think that would be possible. But Erdogan almost certainly comes from a Muslim Brotherhood background. Doesn't acknowledge it, but when he was a young man, he produced and starred in a play that was called Masons, Jews, and Communists, which had the dramatic final line in his peroration that all evil regimes in the world are invented by Jews. He has a strongly Islamist background. Formally, he supports two states. Turkey's involvement with Hamas really goes back to 2006, 1 month after they won the Palestine Legislative Council elections. Khalid Mashal showed up in Turkey, and Turkey has tended to take Hamas's side ever since. Now, at the beginning of this conflict, some people gave Erdogan credit for restraint because he went so far as to say that he was against the killing of civilians in Israel. It tends to imply that he's all in favor of it outside sovereign Israeli territory. He never condemned Hamas. He has never called Hamas terrorists. He has made explicit, actually, since the war began, he had said it earlier too, but with less attention, less fanfare, that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. He also said when he met Bibi Netanyahu, which they did for the first time at the UN in September, that he told them that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. He says that Israel is a criminal terrorist state, and he is going to look into bringing action against Israel at the International Court of Justice. There has been talk, and I really do believe it's strictly talk, of Turkey even intervening militarily. For example, its foreign minister made a comment just 3 days ago that we, Turkey, have not been able to bring about a ceasefire through diplomatic means, but we have other means if necessary. And just as a very final comment, one of Erdogan's great goals is to aggrandize Turkey's position in the world. And indeed, Turkey, I think, probably does have greater standing in the world than it did 2 decades ago. He wanted to be a mediator of this conflict. Clearly, the Israelis had no interest in bringing him into the equation, and it has been Qatar that has emerged instead. That is the wages of his overt support for Hamas. There are different theories about why Erdogan supports Hamas. There are those who say that it's really just about domestic politics, particularly because there are some very important local elections coming up in March. But I would have to say that the overwhelming evidence is that it's really not about politics. It's really about his strong attachment to Islam and to Hamas as, in effect, fellow Muslim brothers.
I'm going to take advantage of Shai Feldman's recent connection with the area around Gaza that was attacked. Shai was president of Sapir College for 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, I believe. Shai, in a conversation we had recently, you remarked that there were people who worked at the college who you knew were murdered, and that it had a traumatic and dramatic impact upon you personally. Not to say it hasn't had on other people, but when you can identify a face and you know a person, it has a gripping impact on your emotion. Tell us what you learned after October 7th about some of the contacts and some of the people you knew and what you walked away with.
The faculty that teaches at Sapir College comes from all over the country. Some of them teach in more than one college. Just as it commutes from Tel Aviv to Ashkelon, others also commute from various parts of the country to teach in Sapir. However, the administrative staff of Sapir, including those that I worked very, very closely with, live in communities that are just across the border from Gaza. Sapir itself is only 1.8 miles from the border. So, first of all, a number of both faculty and administrators and students were murdered on October 7th. Those who were very close to me personally, because they were at the top of the echelons, luckily survived, but they survived some really horrific experiences and are deeply traumatic. They're also relocated. First of all, their neighbors were butchered, and their communities suffered huge damage. They're now scattered through the country. One of them just WhatsApped me yesterday. She's relocated in Eilat, and she said, "We feel like refugees in our own country." Refugees in our own country. The problem here is that they've experienced all those traumatic personal experiences in a situation where they believed that Israel is strong enough and that its adversaries are deterred enough for them to live a rather beautiful life in the south. The mayor of the region called Sha'ar Negev, in which Sapir is located, Ophir Lipstein, he was killed in the first day. And I worked very, very closely with him for 3 years. And he used to say that living in this region is 95% heaven and 5% hell. Well, the 5% hell took over, completely took over with this event. It would take a lot to persuade them, as well as the tens of thousands that have been relocated from the north, to persuade them that they can safely go back. Now, if they don't feel that they can safely go back, again, this is part of the hard news that people have not been told and they need to grasp. If Israel can't create the conditions that would allow these people to go back, that means Israel has surrendered a part of its sovereignty over a part in the south and a part in the north. That's a huge, huge, huge challenge for a country like Israel after 75. And that's the state that we are in right now. And it, of course, involves many, 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 many heart-wrenching personal stories. But in the end, there is also a national story here. And the national story has to be reckoned with. And there will be considerable reckoning. I just want to add one more word to everything that was said already, but on the positive side. Something very interesting happened yesterday that went a little bit unnoticed. In all the news about the hostage deal, Hezbollah announced that they will abide by the ceasefire unless attacked. This is very, very, very important because it means that for those who feared that Hezbollah was looking for an excuse to escalate, it's almost the opposite. It looks like Hezbollah is not interested in escalation. It's also watching what Israel has done in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And Israel has made it very clear that Beirut will be visited similarly if this is going to escalate, is looking to de-escalate, to de-conflict. And they were not part of the negotiations. This is a deal between Israel and Hamas, moderated mostly by Qatar. And then Hezbollah announces that they will abide by the ceasefire, to which they were not a party. And I think this is very significant.
There's one lesson that I've learned in the last 2 weeks, how this war is being portrayed and how it's being felt by those inside Israel and those who are outside Israel, Jews or non-Jews. In Israel, it still is considered a major trauma and existential threat whose outcomes remain completely uncertain, which could dribble on for weeks, if not months. In the United States, we see this as a war in Gaza. The New York Times in the last 7 weeks, half of its pictures on its front page have shown Gaza after Israel's reply. It's almost as if October 7th, outside of Israel, has been forgotten. The news cycle has just taken it over. So when we look at this event as it unfolds, as historians, as we look back on it, I think we have to be able to make distinctions between how Israelis saw it and the personal trauma and the national trauma, which you so well stated just now, Shai, and how we see it in the West or elsewhere as a war that needs a ceasefire, and we don't comprehend what existential means because we don't live under that kind of threat on a day-to-day basis. And it's two very different kinds of interpretation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you like what you saw and you like the webinars, and we'll have another one next week, go to our website and press the donate button. We live on your contributions. Visit the website, learn more, read more, dig deep down.